The morning sun cast long shadows across Magnolia Boulevard, one of Seattle's most picturesque neighborhoods, where Victorian-style homes stood proudly against the backdrop of Puget Sound. Among these architectural gems was the Morrison residence, a carefully restored 1920s craftsman where Julia and Charles had spent the last 5 years building their dream life together. The wraparound porch, adorned with hanging ferns and comfortable wicker furniture, served as their favorite spot for morning coffee and evening contemplation. That particular morning started like any other, with Bob, their 4-year-old golden retriever, performing his usual routine of gentle nudges to wake his humans. The spring air carried the distinct scent of salt water and blooming cherry blossoms, a combination that had initially drawn Julia and Charles to this corner of Seattle. Bob's tail wagged rhythmically against the hardwood floor as he followed Julia downstairs, his nails creating a familiar clicking sound that had become part of their home symphony. 3-month-old Alex's cries echoed through the baby monitor, prompting Julia to quicken her pace. "I'll get him," Charles called from upstairs, his voice still thick with sleep. Bob, typically the epitome of calm confidence, sat at attention near the bottom of the stairs, his chocolate-brown eyes fixed on the front door. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8, its deep chimes announcing the arrival of Phoebe Matthews, their newly hired babysitter. The change in Bob's demeanor was instantaneous and unsettling. As Phoebe's shadow appeared through the frosted glass panels of the front door, his usual friendly disposition vanished. The golden fur along his spine bristled, and a low, threatening growl rumbled from deep within his chest. Julia froze, coffee mug suspended midway to her lips, startled by this unprecedented behavior from their typically gentle companion. "Bob!" Julia's voice carried a note of confusion and concern. In the 4 years since they'd rescued him from the Seattle Humane Society, Bob had never shown aggression toward anyone. He was known throughout the neighborhood as the gentle giant who let toddlers pull his ears and waited patiently while elderly Mrs. Henderson from next door told her lengthy stories about her grandchildren. Phoebe entered, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the morning humidity, wearing crisp khakis and a pale blue blouse that matched the nursery's color scheme. "Good morning," she called out cheerfully, but her greeting was met with another growl from Bob, deeper this time, more warning than welcome. "I'm so sorry," Julia apologized, reaching for Bob's collar. "He's never done this before." "Bob, stop it." The command fell on deaf ears as Bob positioned himself between Phoebe and the stairs, where Charles was descending with Alex cradled in his arms. Charles, a software engineer whose calm logic usually balanced Julia's more intuitive nature, furrowed his brow at the scene before him. "Hey, buddy, what's gotten into you?" he asked, but Bob remained focused on Phoebe, his usual soft expression replaced by an intensity that seemed almost human in its deliberateness. Phoebe maintained her composure, though her smile wavered slightly. "Oh, don't worry about it. Dogs can be protective of new babies. I've seen it before in other families I've worked with." She took a step forward, and Bob's growl intensified, causing Alex to stir uneasily in Charles's arms. The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Julia's hands trembled slightly as she guided Bob toward the kitchen, his resistance evident in every step. Through the kitchen window, she could see their neighbor, Tom Wilson, walking his own dog, and everything seemed surreally normal outside their bubble of sudden discomfort. "Maybe he just needs time to adjust," Charles suggested, but his voice carried an undertone of worry that Julia hadn't heard since the complicated final weeks of her pregnancy. He handed Alex to Phoebe, and Bob's reaction became even more pronounced, a bark that seemed to shake the crystal chandelier in the entryway. The morning light that had seemed so promising earlier now cast strange shadows across their perfectly coordinated living room, where family photos smiled down from the walls, telling stories of happier, simpler times. Julia's eyes lingered on a particular image, Bob's first day with them, his golden fur slightly matted but his eyes full of trust and love. The contrast between that memory and the tense animal before her made her stomach churn. Throughout the morning, Bob refused to leave his post at the kitchen doorway, his eyes tracking Phoebe's every movement as she went about her duties with Alex. The peaceful routine they had envisioned for their family felt like a distant dream, replaced by an undercurrent of unease that none of them could quite explain. As Julia prepared to leave for her job at the local art gallery, she found herself hesitating, her hand resting longer than necessary on Bob's head. His fur had settled, but his eyes remained alert, almost pleading. The morning sun continued its journey across their hardwood floors, but the warmth it brought felt superficial against the chill that had settled in her heart. The following days unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare in the Morrison household. The morning light that once brought hope now seemed to cast shadows of doubt across their lives. Julia found herself waking before dawn, her mind racing with the weight of the impossible decision they faced. The sound of Bob's paws padding across the hardwood floors, once a comfort, now carried an edge of uncertainty. Charles spent his evenings in his home office, door slightly ajar, researching dog behavior specialists and scanning forums for similar situations. The blue light from his computer screen illuminated his increasingly tired face as he scrolled through endless pages of advice and warnings. "There has to be another way," he would mumble, more to himself than to Julia when she brought him his nightly coffee. Their conversations, once filled with dreams and plans, now revolved around a single, heart-wrenching topic. Each discussion felt like reopening a wound that refused to heal. One particularly difficult evening, after Phoebe had left and Alex was finally asleep, Julia and Charles sat at their kitchen island, the space between them feeling wider than ever. "He's always been such a good dog," Julia whispered, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched tea. Bob lay at her feet, his presence both a comfort and a source of their current anguish. "Remember when he stayed up all night with me during my pregnancy insomnia?" Charles nodded, his own eyes fixed on their loyal companion. "And how he knew I was having a panic attack before my big presentation last year?" His voice cracked slightly. "He just put his head in my lap until my breathing steadied." The weight of their potential decision hung heavy in the air. Outside, Seattle's perpetual drizzle tapped against the windows, providing a melancholic soundtrack to their dilemma. Bob's head lifted at the sound of distant thunder, his eyes meeting Julia's with an intelligence that made her heart ache. Their neighbor, Sarah Thompson, had stopped by earlier that day, concern evident in her voice. "I've known Bob since you brought him home," she'd said, her hand resting on Julia's shoulder. "That dog would sooner hurt himself than let anything happen to your family. There must be something else going on." But the incidents with Phoebe continued to escalate. Bob's growls became more frequent, more intense. He positioned himself between the babysitter and Alex at every opportunity, refusing to let her pass without showing signs of aggression. The tension in the house became unbearable, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. One night, after another difficult day, Charles found Julia crying in Alex's nursery, Bob faithfully at her side. "I feel like we're betraying him," she sobbed, her hand buried in Bob's golden fur. "He's part of our family. How can we just send him away?" Charles knelt beside them, his own eyes glistening. "Maybe we could try a professional trainer one more time?" But they both knew they were running out of options. Phoebe had made it clear, either Bob had to go, or she would leave. With both of their careers demanding long hours and no immediate family nearby, losing their babysitter wasn't an option they could afford. The decision came to a head one rainy Wednesday evening. Bob had lunged at Phoebe when she reached for Alex, nearly breaking free from his collar. Though he hadn't made contact, the incident left everyone shaken. That night, Julia and Charles sat on their back porch, the space where they'd spent countless happy evenings now feeling like a courtroom where they had to pass judgment on their beloved pet. "The Seattle Animal Shelter has a good reputation," Charles said softly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "They promised to find him a good home, maybe with someone without children." The words felt like betrayal in his mouth. Julia couldn't speak through her tears. Bob sat between them, as he had done countless times before, seemingly unaware that his fate was being decided. His tail thumped gently against the deck, and his eyes, full of unconditional love, moved between his humans with unwavering trust. The following morning, they made the call. The shelter staff were kind and understanding, assuring them they would take special care of Bob and find him the perfect home. As they prepared for his departure, Julia found herself taking photos of everything. Bob in his favorite sunny spot by the window, Bob with his head on Charles's lap, Bob gently sniffing Alex's feet. The day they took him to the shelter was unseasonably bright for Seattle, as if the weather was mocking their grief. Bob walked willingly into the shelter, tail still wagging, trusting his family as he always had. It wasn't until they turned to leave that they heard his first whimper, a sound that would haunt their dreams for weeks to come. The drive home was silent except for Alex's occasional coos from the back seat. Their house, when they returned, felt immediately different, emptier, colder somehow. The absence of clicking nails on the floor and the gentle breathing of their furry companion created a void that seemed to echo through every room. That night, as they went through their bedtime routine without Bob's supervisory rounds, both Julia and Charles felt the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The nagging feeling that they had missed something crucial, that Bob's behavior had been more than just overprotective instincts, lingered in their minds like a shadow they couldn't quite shake. The Morrison house felt different in the weeks following Bob's departure. The absence of his presence was palpable in every corner, the empty water bowl they couldn't bring themselves to put away, the forgotten tennis balls under furniture, the leash that still hung by the door like a ghost of happier times. But as life continued its relentless forward march, subtle changes began to emerge in their daily routine. Julia found herself increasingly attuned to the small details she might have overlooked before. Perhaps it was maternal instinct sharpened by loss, or maybe it was the void left by their four-legged guardian that made her more vigilant. She noticed how Phoebe's schedule became increasingly erratic, despite her meticulously maintained calendar. "I got stuck in traffic" became a common excuse, though the typical Seattle congestion patterns didn't align with her delayed arrivals. On Tuesdays, when she claimed to take Alex to the local playground, Julia noticed their son's clothes remained suspiciously clean for a baby who supposedly spent an hour playing outdoors. Charles, immersed in a major project at work, initially dismissed Julia's concerns as paranoia born from guilt over Bob. "We're just more sensitive to everything right now," he'd say, his eyes fixed on his laptop screen. But even he couldn't ignore the strange phone calls Phoebe would take in hushed tones on the back porch, quickly ending them whenever someone approached. One particularly unsettling incident occurred during a rare afternoon when Julia came home early from the gallery. She found Phoebe standing over Alex's crib, not doing anything, just watching. The scene itself might have seemed innocent enough, but something in the babysitter's expression sent chills down Julia's spine. It reminded her of someone studying a puzzle they needed to solve, rather than watching over a child with affection. "Oh, I was just checking if he was cold," Phoebe had explained, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "He was stirring a bit." But Alex had been sleeping soundly, and the baby monitor on Julia's hip had broadcast nothing but peaceful breathing for the past hour. The house itself seemed to hold its breath during Phoebe's hours there. The warm, loving home they'd created felt more like a stage set, with everyone playing prescribed roles in some undefined drama. Julia began finding things slightly out of place. Charles's home office door ajar when it should have been locked, documents on their kitchen counter rearranged, the wireless router unplugged for no apparent reason. During their evening video calls to the shelter to check on Bob, Julia and Charles could see their beloved dog's depression deepen. The shelter staff reported that he barely ate and spent most of his time by the door, as if waiting for his family to return. Each call ended with Julia in tears and Charles struggling to maintain his composure. "He knew something we didn't," Julia whispered one night, after another concerning day. "Remember how he always positioned himself between Alex and Phoebe? Never aggressive toward anyone else, just her." The following week, Julia noticed something else. Alex, usually an active and engaged baby, seemed unusually lethargic during Phoebe's shifts. At first, the babysitter attributed it to growth spurts or changing sleep patterns, but Julia's maternal instinct screamed that something was wrong. She began keeping a detailed journal of Alex's behavior patterns, noting the stark difference between weekends with them and weekdays with Phoebe. Their typically cheerful son became drowsy and disoriented during the babysitter's hours, only to return to his normal self by evening. The breaking point came during a routine cleaning day when Julia found an unfamiliar prescription bottle tucked behind the changing table supplies. The label had been partially scratched off, but the remaining text made her blood run cold. She quickly photographed it before returning it exactly as she'd found it, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone. That evening, she showed Charles the photo, and for the first time, his tech-focused mind fully engaged with her concerns. They spent hours reviewing their home security cameras, which they'd installed after Bob left, a decision driven by the unsettling void his absence created. The footage revealed Phoebe methodically going through their files late at night when she occasionally stayed over, photographing documents with her phone, and accessing Charles's home office computer. "Bob was right all along," Charles whispered, his face pale in the blue light of the security footage. "He was trying to protect Alex, to protect all of us." The weight of their mistake crashed down on them like a physical force. Their loyal protector, the one member of their family who had seen the truth, was sitting in a shelter cage while they had allowed a potential threat to remain in their home. The realization was devastating. Julia found herself staring at old photos of Bob on her phone during sleepless nights, his intelligent eyes seeming to convey the warning they had failed to heed. The image of him being led away to the shelter, still trusting them despite everything, haunted her dreams. The house creaked and settled in the night, each sound amplified by their growing awareness of vulnerability. Without Bob's reassuring presence, every shadow seemed longer, every unexpected noise more sinister. They began to understand that their dog's protective instincts hadn't been the problem, they had been the solution they'd foolishly discarded. The night that everything came to a head started like any other, with Seattle's characteristic autumn rain drumming against the windows. Julia had been unable to sleep, her mind racing with the mounting evidence of something sinister happening in her home. Around midnight, she heard unusual movements downstairs, too deliberate to be the house settling. Leaving Charles asleep, Julia crept down the hallway, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give her away. The wooden stairs, which usually creaked under any weight, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment and remained silent under her careful steps. As she reached the bottom, a sliver of light from Charles's home office caught her attention. Through the partially open door, she could see Phoebe's silhouette illuminated by the computer screen. The babysitter had stayed over, claiming her car had battery issues, an excuse that now seemed painfully transparent. Julia watched as Phoebe methodically inserted a USB drive into Charles's computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Drawing on courage she didn't know she possessed, Julia retreated to the kitchen, her mind racing. She needed evidence, concrete proof of what was happening. Her hands trembled as she activated the video recording function on her phone, carefully positioning it to capture the office entrance through a gap in the decorative vase arrangement on the counter. While waiting, Julia began searching the kitchen, starting with Phoebe's oversized bag left carelessly by the breakfast nook. Inside, she found a false bottom concealing a collection of items that made her blood run cold, several orange prescription bottles with scratched-off labels, a small notebook filled with what appeared to be bank account numbers and passwords, and most disturbingly, detailed notes about their family's daily routines. The sound of footsteps sent Julia scrambling to replace everything exactly as she'd found it. Phoebe emerged from the office, holding what looked like financial documents from their filing cabinet. When she spotted Julia in the kitchen, she froze, her composed facade cracking for just a moment before smoothing into her usual pleasant smile. "Oh, Julia, you startled me," Phoebe said, quickly tucking the papers behind her back. "I was just getting some water." Without turning on any lights. Julia's voice was steady, despite her racing heart. "And I suppose those documents behind your back are just some light reading material?" The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Through the window, lightning illuminated the street, casting dramatic shadows across Phoebe's face as her expression transformed from friendly to calculating in an instant. "You should have stayed upstairs," Phoebe said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Everything was going so smoothly. Do you know how long I've been planning this? How many families I've had to work with before finding one with access to the kind of information your husband handles?" Julia's mind raced to Alex sleeping upstairs, to Charles, to the security system's panic button just inches from her hand under the counter. "The medications," she said, buying time as she inched closer to the alarm. "What have you been giving my baby?" Phoebe's laugh was cold, nothing like the warm chuckle they'd grown used to. "Just enough to keep him drowsy and compliant. Can't have a crying baby drawing attention while I work, can I? Your precious Bob figured it out though, animals always do. That's why he had to go." The mention of Bob ignited something in Julia. All the guilt, anger, and fear of the past weeks crystallized into a fierce determination. In one fluid motion, she slammed her hand on the panic button just as Phoebe lunged forward. The alarm's shriek split the night air. Above, she heard Charles's startled shout and Alex's crying. Phoebe grabbed Julia's arm, trying to drag her away from the counter, but years of carrying art pieces and rearranging gallery displays had made Julia stronger than she looked. They grappled in the kitchen, knocking over chairs and sending Phoebe's bag spilling across the floor. The scattered evidence of her deception, the drugs, the notebooks, the stolen documents, created a damning trail across the tile floor. Charles appeared at the kitchen entrance, taking in the scene with wide eyes. His presence distracted Phoebe just long enough for Julia to break free and position herself between the intruder and the stairs leading to Alex. "It's over," Julia said, her voice shaking but determined. "The police are already on their way. Every piece of evidence is recorded. Every document you stole, every drug you gave our son, everything." Phoebe's eyes darted between them and the door, calculating her chances. The wail of approaching sirens made the decision for her. She bolted for the exit, but Charles was faster, tackling her to the ground just as red and blue lights began flooding through the windows. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, evidence collection, and medical examinations. Alex was rushed to the hospital for testing, though thankfully the drugs in his system were mild sedatives, designed to make him sleepy rather than cause harm. The police discovered that Phoebe, whose real name was Margaret Wells, was wanted in 3 states for similar schemes, targeting families with access to sensitive corporate information. As dawn broke over Seattle, Julia sat in Alex's hospital room, watching her son sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. Charles stood by the window, his face a mixture of guilt and relief as he spoke with the detective in charge of their case. The days following Phoebe's arrest brought a whirlwind of activity to the Morrison household. Police investigators came and went, collecting evidence and taking statements. The full scope of Phoebe's scheme emerged like a dark tapestry unraveling. She had been part of a sophisticated corporate espionage ring targeting tech companies through their employees' families. Charles's position at his cybersecurity firm had made them an ideal target. The relief of having the threat removed was immediate, but it came with a heavy burden of guilt. Each new detail from the investigation felt like another indictment of their decision to doubt Bob's instincts. Julia found herself standing in front of Bob's empty bed multiple times a day, running her fingers over his unwashed blanket that still held his scent. "We have to get him back," she announced one morning, exactly 3 weeks after Phoebe's arrest. Charles looked up from his coffee, dark circles under his eyes from nights spent helping the FBI trace the extent of the information breach at his company. "I called the shelter yesterday," he admitted, a small smile breaking through his exhausted expression. "They said he's still there. No one wanted to adopt him because he seems broken-hearted." The drive to the Seattle animal shelter felt both eternal and too quick. The autumn rain had given way to an unusually clear day, the kind that made Mount Rainier appear close enough to touch. Julia clutched the folder containing their reinstatement paperwork while Charles navigated through the morning traffic, both of them too nervous to speak. Sarah, the shelter coordinator who had helped them that terrible day weeks ago, met them at the entrance. "He's been waiting for you," she said softly, leading them through the corridor of kennels. "It's like he knew you'd come back." The sound of barking filled the air, but one kennel remained quiet. In the corner of the last run, Bob lay curled up, his golden fur dulled by weeks of depression. His head lifted slightly at their approach, and for a moment, Julia feared he wouldn't recognize them or, worse, wouldn't forgive them. Then his tail thumped once against the concrete floor. "Bob!" Julia's voice cracked as she knelt by the kennel door. "Oh, buddy, we're so sorry." The change in Bob was instantaneous. He scrambled to his feet, his entire body wiggling with joy as his tail wagged with enough force to shake his whole back end. The sound he made was somewhere between a whine and a bark, a vocalization of pure emotion that brought tears to everyone's eyes. When Sarah opened the kennel door, Bob didn't bound out as one might expect. Instead, he approached slowly, deliberately, pressing his head first into Julia's hands and then into Charles's, as if reassuring himself that this was real, that his family had truly returned for him. "We should have trusted you," Charles whispered, burying his face in Bob's fur. "You knew all along, didn't you, boy? You were protecting Alex, protecting all of us." The drive home was entirely different from their last car ride together. Bob sat in the back seat, his head held high, watching the familiar streets pass by through the window. Every few minutes, he would lean forward to gently lick Julia's shoulder or press his nose against Charles's arm, as if making sure they were still there. Arriving home, Bob immediately went into inspection mode. He moved from room to room, nose working overtime, checking every corner and space that Phoebe had occupied. When he reached Alex's nursery, where the baby was being watched by Charles's mother, his approach was cautious but determined. Margaret, Charles's mother, had tears in her eyes as she watched Bob gently sniff Alex, who immediately broke into delighted giggles at the sight of his furry protector. "This is how it should have been all along," she said, watching Bob position himself by the crib, assuming his self-appointed guard duty. The following days saw a gradual return to normalcy, but with a deeper appreciation for the bonds that held their family together. Bob's presence filled the house with warmth again, his paw steps on the hardwood floors a comforting rhythm that helped erase the memories of darker times. They established new routines, more careful ones. Julia reduced her hours at the gallery to spend more time at home. Charles implemented stricter security measures, both digital and physical. But most importantly, they learned to trust their instincts, and Bob's, without question. The local news ran a small story about the case, praising Bob's role in protecting the family. The shelter used it to promote the intelligence and loyalty of rescue dogs, leading to a surge in adoptions. Bob, unaware of his minor celebrity status, remained focused solely on his family, especially Alex, who had begun crawling and found in Bob a patient, protective companion for his explorations. One evening, as Seattle's early winter darkness settled around their home, Julia sat on the porch swing with Bob's head in her lap, watching Charles play with Alex on their small lawn. The moment felt precious in its simplicity, made more valuable by how close they had come to losing it all. "You know what, Bob," she whispered, scratching behind his ears just the way he liked. "Sometimes the best security system isn't made of circuits and cameras. Sometimes it's got 4 legs, a wagging tail, and a heart bigger than we deserve." Bob's response was a contented sigh and a gentle paw placed on her knee, his way of saying all was forgiven, all was right in their world again. As the seasons changed and Seattle's winter gave way to spring, the Morrison family found themselves settling into a new rhythm, one that was both familiar and profoundly different from before. The ordeal with Phoebe had left its mark, but like the cherry blossoms that now adorned their street, new life and hope had emerged from the darkness. Bob, once again the cornerstone of their household, had taken on his role as protector with a renewed sense of purpose. His golden coat had regained its luster, and his eyes sparkled with the contentment of a dog who knew, without a doubt, that he was home. He shadowed Alex's steps as the toddler's wobbly walks turned into confident runs, always there to provide a steady presence or a soft landing when needed. Julia and Charles found themselves marveling at the depth of Bob's understanding. It wasn't just his protective instincts that amazed them, but his emotional intelligence. He seemed to know exactly when one of them needed comfort, appearing with a gentle nudge or a paw on the knee during moments of stress or sadness. One particularly poignant moment came when Charles, still grappling with the aftermath of the security breach at his company, had a panic attack late one night. Before Julia could even stir from her sleep, Bob was there, pressing his weight against Charles's chest, his steady heartbeat providing a rhythm for Charles to match his breathing to. It was a technique they had never taught him, yet he performed it instinctively. "I don't know how he knows," Charles said afterward, his voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "It's like he can read our minds sometimes." Julia nodded, remembering all the times Bob had anticipated her needs during her pregnancy and after Alex's birth. "I think it's because he listens with more than just his ears. He listens with his heart." Their experience had rippled out into their community as well. Julia, inspired by Bob's unwavering loyalty, started volunteering at the shelter where they had briefly surrendered him. She organized a program that paired rescue dogs with families for trial periods, believing that if more people could experience the bond they shared with Bob, more dogs would find loving homes. Charles, for his part, channeled his guilt and gratitude into action at work. He spearheaded a new initiative in his company to incorporate animal-assisted therapy for employees dealing with stress and anxiety. The sight of dogs in the office became common, and employee morale soared. He often joked that Bob should be on the payroll as a security consultant. As Alex grew, so did his bond with Bob. The dog became his confidant, playmate, and protector all rolled into one. When Alex started preschool, it was Bob who helped ease his separation anxiety, sitting patiently by the window each afternoon, waiting for the little boy's return. Their neighbors, who had witnessed the entire saga unfold, became closer to the Morrisons. The community rallied around them, and Bob became something of a local celebrity. Children would ask to pet him on walks, and adults would stop to chat, often sharing their own stories of remarkable pets. Sarah Thompson, their next-door neighbor who had initially vouched for Bob's character, became a close family friend. "You know," she said one evening over a backyard barbecue, watching Bob and Alex play fetch, "I always believed there was something special about Bob, but I never imagined he'd end up being a hero." The word hero was one the Morrisons had grappled with. To them, Bob was simply being Bob, loyal, loving, and fiercely protective. But they couldn't deny the profound impact his actions had on their lives. As Alex grew older and began to understand more about the events that had transpired when he was a baby, Julia and Charles made a point of teaching him about trust, instinct, and the importance of listening to those who care about you, whether they speak with words or not. "Bob knew something was wrong even when we didn't believe him," Julia explained to a wide-eyed Alex one night during story time. "He teaches us that sometimes, we need to trust our feelings, even if we can't explain why." The lesson wasn't lost on Alex, who developed a keen sense of empathy and an ability to read others that his parents attributed, at least in part, to his unique bond with Bob. Years passed, and Bob's muzzle began to gray, but his spirit remained as vibrant as ever. He moved a bit slower, but his dedication never wavered. The Morrisons found themselves cherishing each moment, acutely aware of how precious their time together was. On Bob's 10th adoption anniversary, they threw him a party that the entire neighborhood attended. The backyard was filled with laughter, barking, and the joyous sounds of a community brought together by the love of one remarkable dog. As the sun set on that celebratory day, Julia and Charles sat on their porch swing, Bob at their feet, watching Alex play with his friends. The scene before them was one of perfect contentment, a far cry from the turmoil they had once faced. "You know," Charles mused, his hand finding Julia's, "I used to think I understood what it meant to be loyal, to be part of a family. But Bob, he's taught me that it's so much more than just being there. It's about seeing the truth when others can't, standing firm when it would be easier to give in." Julia nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "He's shown us that home isn't just a place, it's a feeling. It's where you're understood, protected, and loved unconditionally." Bob, as if understanding the weight of the moment, raised his head and looked at them, his brown eyes full of the wisdom that comes from a life lived with purpose and love. He then turned his gaze back to Alex, ever watchful, ever present. The Morrisons had faced a trial that could have torn their family apart. Instead, it had brought them closer, not just to each other, but to a deeper understanding of what it means to trust, to protect, and to love. And at the heart of it all was Bob, their golden guardian, a living reminder that sometimes, the most profound connections in life come with 4 paws and a wagging tail. As night fell and stars began to twinkle over Seattle, the Morrison house stood as a testament to resilience, to second chances, and to the enduring power of a bond between humans and their canine companions. In Bob, they had found not just a pet, but a guardian, a teacher, and a true member of their family. One who had taught them that the real measure of loyalty is not in never making mistakes, but in how we learn from them and grow stronger together.